In the town square of Salem, Massachusetts, in the year 1692, an elderly woman named Margaret Scott stands trembling, accused of a crime so absurd yet devastating, it would change the course of her life. At 77 years old, her frailty and isolation only add to the terror she feels. She has been accused of causing a neighbor's cow to fall ill simply by looking at it wrong. This accusation, rooted in superstition and paranoia, marks the beginning of her horrific journey into the heart of the infamous witch trials. Margaret, however, will not be the last. She will be victim number 19, a small but pivotal part of a campaign of terror that would soon sweep through the region and claim dozens of lives. But here is where the narrative diverges from what many believe. Witch hunts are often seen as chaotic, irrational bursts of fear and superstition, driven by the hysteria of uneducated, fearful peasants. This is only half of the story. What history fails to reveal is the calculated machinery of fear behind the witch trials, where those in power, religious authorities, legal scholars, and state officials, used witch hunts not as spontaneous outbursts of irrationality, but as deliberate campaigns of control and manipulation. The witch trials were not simply about fear of the supernatural. They were about power. Power wielded through fear. Power cultivated by authorities who knew exactly how to use superstition as a tool for social control. Fear of witches was not just a fear of the unknown, but a fear carefully nurtured and sustained by those who stood to gain from its spread. Margaret Scott's story is just one of many that illustrates the true nature of the witch hunts. She is about to be swept up in a system that combines religious fervor with legal authority to create a terrifying and brutal spectacle. Yet her story, though tragic, is just a glimpse into a much larger and far more sinister machine, one that spans across continents and centuries. It's important to understand something essential about the witch trials. They were not simply the products of an ignorant and superstitious populace. They were systematically orchestrated. The witch trials were designed with precision and purpose, drawing on the intellectual and cultural currents of the Renaissance. While figures like Galileo and Shakespeare were advancing human knowledge and culture, scholars, clergy, and legal experts were applying the same intellectual rigor to the creation of systems of fear and torture that would terrorize entire populations. Margaret Scott's trial, like many others, would be based on a set of assumptions about power, about authority, and about the very nature of humanity. To understand her fate and the fate of those like her, we need to peel back the layers of history and examine the sophisticated methods used to turn fear into a weapon of social control. In this narrative, the witch hunts are not just a series of isolated events, but part of a larger, global network of persecution designed to enforce conformity, silence dissent, and maintain the power of those at the top. The true nature of the witch trials was far more calculated, far more intentional, and far more terrifying than we've been led to believe. The witch trials were not born out of spontaneous hysteria. Far from it. They were shaped by intellectuals, legal scholars, and religious authorities who understood the power of fear and used it as a strategic weapon. The witch trials, particularly those in Europe and the American colonies, were orchestrated through highly organized systems that reflected the intellectual rigor of their time. These systems had nothing to do with primitive superstition, but everything to do with a deliberate and calculated approach to social control. At the heart of this dark campaign was Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Written in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, this document became the blueprint for witch hunts across Europe. More than just a religious treatise, the Malleus Maleficarum was an instructional manual on how to identify, prosecute, and torture suspected witches. It wasn't just a guide on combating evil. It was a comprehensive manual for how to use terror to maintain power, control, and conformity. The Malleus was not some rambling pamphlet fueled by fear. It was a highly detailed, systematic work that combined theological arguments with legal and forensic methodology. In its pages, Kramer and Springer laid out step-by-step instructions for torturing confessions from women and men accused of witchcraft, detailing everything from the appropriate use of physical pain to the psychological tactics necessary to break a person's will. Witchcraft was no longer just a religious or spiritual threat in the eyes of those in power. It became a legal and social one. What began as a spiritual purge quickly turned into a sophisticated, bureaucratic machine for societal control. Accusations of witchcraft were no longer just about fear of the supernatural. They became tools for enforcing social and political order. By calling someone a witch, you were not just accusing them of a crime. You were accusing them of defying the very fabric of society, and you were opening the door to their public destruction. What is truly chilling about the witch trials is how this process, which was grounded in systematic reasoning and intellectual frameworks, could lead to such brutal outcomes. While scholars across Europe were debating philosophy and advancing scientific understanding, others were using those same intellectual tools to justify systematic cruelty. The question, then, is not why the witch trials happened, but how such a learned society could turn these intellectual advancements to such dark ends. These witch hunts were not simply chaotic bursts of violence. They were carefully executed operations that relied on the full cooperation of the church, the state, and intellectual authorities. Every step of the process, accusation, trial, interrogation, torture, execution, was informed by highly structured and well-documented methods, meticulously devised by legal scholars and religious authorities who understood human nature as deeply as they understood the tenets of their faith. At the time, these intellectuals believed they were performing a vital public service. They believed they were protecting society from supernatural forces. Yes, but more importantly, they saw themselves as enforcers of social order. Through their writings, actions, and laws, they sought to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to that order. And in a society that was deeply embedded in religious orthodoxy, the accusation of witchcraft became a convenient way to remove anyone who threatened the established power structures, be they women, intellectuals, or political rivals. As much as we want to view the witch trials as products of ignorance and fear, the reality is far more sinister. They were not just outbreaks of mass hysteria, but structured, deliberate campaigns to maintain control and suppress dissent. Witch trials were not merely a tool of religious and political control. They were also a lucrative business. For many, the hunt for witches was an economic enterprise as much as a spiritual one. Behind the fervor and the hysteria, there were financial incentives that ensured the continuation of the witch hunts, creating a self-sustaining system of terror that enriched those involved in the persecution. In England, the infamous Matthew Hopkins, self-proclaimed witch-finder general, became the most prominent figure in turning witch hunting into a profitable venture. Between 1645 and 1647, Hopkins and his assistants conducted witch hunts across East Anglia, claiming to have identified hundreds of witches. His methods were crude but effective. Accusations, arrest, and execution followed quickly, with each step bringing a financial reward. Hopkins' success wasn't rooted in his investigative skills. He was simply able to exploit fear. Communities paid him for his services, which included arresting suspected witches, conducting trials, and overseeing executions. He made substantial sums by charging towns and villages for the privilege of having him clear their area of witchcraft. To add to his profits, he collected a percentage of the confiscated property of those accused. It was a business model that incentivized fear, feeding off the paranoia that pervaded society. But Hopkins' model was not isolated. Across Europe, witch trials were similarly profitable. Local authorities, eager to increase their wealth, could seize property from the accused, often the most valuable assets in a rural community. As with the Spanish Inquisition, which seized lands from accused heretics, witch trials became a powerful mechanism for redistributing wealth under the guise of legal and religious righteousness. Hopkins' witch-hunting operations were far from random. He had a keen understanding of the economic landscape, and he used this knowledge to perpetuate witch hunts where the financial gains were greatest. His methods became a blueprint for other witch-finders, who recognized that the more accusations they made, the more money they could earn. The process was simple: stir up fear, identify witches, and profit from their persecution. The widespread nature of the witch hunts, particularly during the 17th century, shows how deeply intertwined fear and economy were. The social hysteria surrounding witchcraft was not merely a product of irrational beliefs, but a reflection of the political and economic systems in place. Fear of witches was carefully cultivated, and the witch trials were designed to ensure that fear never waned. It was a continuous cycle where those who could maintain and amplify that fear reaped immense rewards, while the victims of the trials lost their lives, families, and livelihoods. In a way, the witch hunts became a business model, one that stretched across Europe and the Americas. The fear of witchcraft, once confined to local folklore, became institutionalized and economically incentivized, creating a widespread and enduring campaign that left a deep scar on history. The financial rewards ensured that the machinery of terror would not easily be dismantled, even as some communities began to question the validity of the trials. For every witch executed, there were more victims waiting to be consumed by the machine of persecution. But what was truly terrifying about this economic incentive was how it made the witch trials self-perpetuating. The more witches were accused, the more money there was to be made. The more property was seized, the more incentive there was to expand the trials. The witch hunts became a self-sustaining terror campaign, rooted not just in superstition and fear, but in a greed-driven system of exploitation that kept it alive for generations. The Renaissance, a time of great cultural and intellectual flourishing, was paradoxically also a period that saw the rise of some of the most sophisticated methods of human torture and destruction. As human knowledge expanded in the realms of art, science, and philosophy, it was also applied, with chilling precision, to the development of torture techniques used during the witch trials. While figures like Galileo, Shakespeare, and Michelangelo were reshaping the cultural landscape with revolutionary discoveries, groundbreaking literature, and masterpieces of art, other intellectuals were using their education and skills to refine tools of cruelty. This juxtaposition of human enlightenment alongside the dark machinery of oppression paints a disturbing picture of the era. While scholars were debating the nature of the universe, others were applying scientific principles to the destruction of human beings. In particular, the application of Renaissance engineering to torture devices reveals the chilling intersection of intellectual sophistication and brutal cruelty. Torturers, some of whom were educated in the finest universities, approached the human body with a detached, almost clinical mindset. They studied human anatomy with the same attention to detail that doctors and scientists of the time used for medical advancements. This knowledge was twisted to create instruments of torture that could inflict maximum pain while ensuring the victim remained alive long enough to confess. Take, for example, the development of the witch's chair, a device that represented the pinnacle of Renaissance engineering applied to human suffering. This chair, with its spiked surfaces strategically placed to target nerve clusters without causing immediate death, was designed by individuals who understood anatomy far better than most doctors of the day. The calculated cruelty behind such devices showed that the intellectual elite of the Renaissance were not simply passive observers of suffering. They were active creators of it. The precision with which these devices were designed is deeply unsettling. Torturers understood that the pain inflicted on the body could be maximized through knowledge of human anatomy, the principles of leverage, and the psychology of fear. This was no longer about mindless cruelty. It was about applying intellectual knowledge to human destruction with the same methodical approach used for designing machines, conducting experiments, or even painting portraits. Torture was treated like a science, with manuals and instructions handed down from one generation of inquisitors to the next. In this context, the witch trials were not merely the result of religious fervor or mass hysteria. They were the outcome of a deliberate, intellectual project, one that used the tools of the Renaissance to create systems of control, fear, and violence. While intellectuals were challenging the old ways of thinking in fields like astronomy and philosophy, others were creating new ways to break the human body and spirit in the name of religious and social order. The role of intellectuals in these campaigns of terror highlights a deeply troubling reality. Education and enlightenment did not always lead to moral progress. The very same intellectual climate that produced brilliant works of art, literature, and scientific inquiry also enabled some of the most devastating forms of human cruelty. These intellectuals, who had the knowledge and resources to shape society, chose to use their talents not to uplift humanity, but to build mechanisms of terror that would haunt entire populations for centuries to come. Thus, the witch trials were not an aberration in a time of ignorance. They were part of a deliberate and calculated strategy by an educated elite to maintain control over society through fear, violence, and torture. The intellectual and scientific advancements of the Renaissance were, in some cases, co-opted for the most horrific purposes, demonstrating that progress in knowledge does not always equate to progress in morality. The witch hunts were not chaotic outbursts of fear or superstition, but rather highly structured events that followed strict legal frameworks and were supported by meticulously designed torture manuals. These manuals, some written by university-trained experts in law, theology, and medicine, guided authorities on how to properly conduct witch trials, from the accusation phase all the way to the execution. One of the most notorious of these manuals was Malleus Maleficarum, which, though rooted in religious dogma, also employed a methodical approach to the identification, interrogation, and punishment of witches. The Malleus served as more than just a theological guide. It was a legal document that gave authorities explicit instructions on how to conduct a witch hunt in a way that appeared to be both just and scientifically sound. The role of legal frameworks in witch trials cannot be overstated. Inquisitors did not simply act on whim or superstition. They followed a well-established set of rules, many of which were based on scholarly interpretations of law and theology. The trials themselves were often carried out with the same level of bureaucratic precision as any modern legal proceeding. Records were kept, confessions were documented, and the legal justification for every act of torture and execution was carefully noted, often in the most mundane of terms. This bureaucratic approach was necessary for the witch hunts to function as a system of mass persecution. It provided the appearance of legitimacy and order, despite the brutality at its core. The torturers and inquisitors knew that their actions would be scrutinized, so they built a framework that allowed them to claim that they were simply following the law. This legal cover was essential to the perpetuation of witch hunts across Europe and the colonies. It allowed authorities to sidestep moral and ethical concerns by framing the trials as part of a legitimate judicial process, rather than a barbaric crusade based on superstition. This legal justification also allowed for the systematic use of torture, with each act of violence being codified and excused under the banner of legal necessity. For instance, the use of the witch's chair, with its strategically placed spikes, was not seen as an act of cruelty, but as a necessary procedure to extract confessions. These manuals and their legal frameworks gave torturers permission to push the boundaries of human endurance while keeping the appearance of legitimacy intact. Moreover, the international nature of the witch trials meant that these legal frameworks and torture methods were not confined to a single nation or region. In fact, they were shared across Europe and even extended to the New World. The Spanish Inquisition, for example, maintained an international network of inquisitors who exchanged information and standardized procedures for identifying, interrogating, and punishing witches. Torture manuals and technical drawings for devices like the witch's chair were circulated widely, ensuring that the methods of destruction were consistent across jurisdictions. Even as some intellectuals began to challenge the validity of the witch trials, the legal systems put in place ensured that these campaigns of terror could continue without disruption. By framing the trials as judicial processes, they were able to manipulate public opinion and even convince the educated elite that they were necessary. The creation of a legal framework for witch hunting transformed what should have been an outrageous violation of human rights into something that, to the authorities seemed both justified and organized. The psychological and cultural effects of these legal systems were profound. Citizens became conditioned to believe that the systematic destruction of suspected witches was not just acceptable, but necessary for the survival of society. Laws and legal procedures designed to ensure fairness were twisted to facilitate cruelty, and in doing so, they created an environment where the most horrific abuses could be carried out under the guise of justice. One of the most haunting examples of Renaissance ingenuity turned to cruelty is the story of Anna Gelli, the last person executed for witchcraft in Europe in 1782. Her case stands as a chilling testament to how intellectual knowledge was weaponized against the human body. Anna's execution wasn't just about public punishment. It was a carefully calculated procedure, engineered with scientific precision, to extract a confession and break her will. The device that would seal her fate was known as the witch's chair. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard instrument of torture, but its design was far more sophisticated than most people realize. The witch's chair was not just an impromptu device thrown together in a dungeon. It was the product of advanced knowledge in human anatomy, geometry, and physics. Its design took into account the body's pain thresholds, applying pressure to specific areas while avoiding fatal injury, prolonging the victim's agony for as long as possible without ending their life too soon. The chair itself was made of iron, and its back was lined with sharp, strategically placed spikes. These spikes weren't random. They were positioned to pierce nerve clusters and inflict excruciating pain, maximizing the suffering without hitting vital organs that might cause immediate death. The design, informed by the understanding of human anatomy, was intended to break the body slowly, turning the victim's every movement into an agonizing experience. What made it even more insidious was the use of gradual heating beneath the chair. Fires were carefully stoked to heat the metal, making it glow unbearably hot while the victim was strapped in place, unable to escape. As the heat increased, the pain intensified, and each stage of the torture would be followed by an interrogation designed to extract a confession. But the witch's chair wasn't just a tool of physical torture. It was a psychological weapon. Victims were led to believe that confession could end their suffering, that admitting to witchcraft was their only chance at escape. Yet, even when they did confess, the torment continued, because the authorities had already decided their fate. It wasn't about truth or justice. It was about forcing individuals to break in mind and body, to submit entirely to the will of the inquisitors. Anna Gelli, like many others, was subjected to this horrifying process. Her confession, as the torturers knew, would not save her. It would only prolong her suffering, creating a paradoxical choice between certain death through silence or prolonged agony through admission. This cruel manipulation of the mind was as much a part of the process as the physical pain itself. The witch's chair exemplified the marriage of Renaissance engineering with human suffering. It was not simply a primitive device for inflicting pain, but a calculated instrument of torture designed with scientific precision, exploiting knowledge of the human body to cause the maximum amount of suffering, while preserving the victim's life long enough to force them into a confession. The legacy of devices like the witch's chair was not merely confined to medieval times or the early modern era. Their influence reverberated well into the 20th century, as authoritarian regimes studied and adopted these methods of torture. The idea that physical and psychological pressure could be applied with such calculated precision to break human will become a cornerstone of torture practices in later centuries. What is most disturbing about Anna Jelly's case is not just the method of torture itself, but the chilling realization that these intellectuals, who were part of Europe's educated elite, had the power to turn scientific knowledge into instruments of terror, showing how education, when twisted, can become a tool of unimaginable cruelty. Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general, turned the act of hunting witches into a highly profitable business, a model that was replicated across England during the height of the witch trials. His reign of terror, from 1645 to 1647, marked a disturbing period where fear and suspicion became commodities, bought and sold for personal profit. Hopkins' rise to power began when he realized the potential for wealth in the witch-finding business. Unlike other witch hunters who might have been driven by religious zeal, Hopkins understood that a well-placed accusation could lead to execution, and with it, the confiscation of a witch's property. This was a system of exploitation, where the accused witches, often vulnerable and marginalized, were not only robbed of their lives but also of their wealth. Hopkins's methods were cruel and bizarre. His so-called witch tests, such as the infamous swimming test, were designed not to uncover the truth but to guarantee a death sentence. The test was a twisted form of logic. If the accused floated, they were guilty of witchcraft, as the water was considered to reject the impure. If they sank and drowned, they were deemed innocent, but they would still die. This test, while seemingly based on medieval superstition, was actually a clever way to ensure that the accused could not escape their fate. In Hopkins's mind, there was no possibility of innocence, only guilt and execution. The financial incentives behind these witch hunts are often overlooked. Hopkins charged communities large sums for his services, which included identifying witches, overseeing trials, and conducting executions. He also profited from the property of those he condemned. This was not just about religious purges or social cleansing. It was a business enterprise that capitalized on fear, uncertainty, and superstition. The more witches he found, the more money he made. It was a self-perpetuating cycle. Fear led to accusations, which led to executions, which led to confiscated property, and Hopkins lined his pockets with the proceeds. For the people of the communities where Hopkins worked, the situation was grim. Fear ran rampant, and accusations could be easily made against anyone, particularly women who were socially isolated, older, or perceived as eccentric. Once accused, they were trapped. Their properties could be seized by authorities, and their families left destitute. This created a terrifying environment where people turned on each other, driven by the prospect of gaining material wealth from the execution of their neighbors. What made Hopkins even more dangerous was his ability to use the fear of witches to manipulate entire communities. He didn't just operate as a lone figure. He created an atmosphere of panic where neighbors were eager to accuse one another in exchange for the promise of riches. The authorities, eager to eliminate perceived threats to social order and willing to profit from the persecution, eagerly supported him. By working in concert with local officials and religious leaders, Hopkins ensured that his witch hunts were not only profitable, but also politically and socially sanctioned. Hopkins's model of witch finding became a blueprint for others. His success demonstrated how fear could be monetized, and how the witch trials could be used not only for social control but for personal gain. His methods, manipulating both fear and superstition, would go on to influence witch hunts in other parts of Europe and the American colonies. The witch trial industry was born, where the hunt for witches wasn't just about rooting out evil, it was about securing power and wealth through systematic exploitation. Today, when we think of the witch trials, we often focus on the tragedy of the innocent victims and the horror of the torture they endured. But we must also remember that for many, it was a business, a lucrative and terrifying one. The wealth and power gained through witch trials created a perverse incentive to continue the hunts, ensuring that they would rage on for years, even decades, long after the supposed threat of witchcraft had faded into the past. One of the most perverse and brutal tests used during the witch trials was the swimming test, a cruel ritual that guaranteed death, no matter the outcome. Invented by Matthew Hopkins and widely practiced in England during the mid-17th century, the swimming test was a judicial murder disguised as a divine judgment. It was, on its surface, a method to determine whether someone was a witch, but in reality, it was an ironclad death sentence designed with one purpose in mind: to eliminate anyone who was accused of witchcraft. The test was simple in its cruel logic. A suspected witch would be bound and thrown into water. If the person floated, it was taken as proof of their guilt. In the eyes of those who carried out the test, the floating was seen as a rejection by the water, believed to be an element that could not accept the purity of a witch's body. Floating meant the person was impure, marked by the devil, and would then be executed. If, on the other hand, the person sank, it was considered a sign of innocence, but the victim would drown before they could be rescued, as they were bound and weighed down. This test is a perfect example of how the witch trials were designed to manipulate the situation to ensure the death of the accused. The test's logic was a perversion of reason, crafted to maintain the illusion of divine judgment, while in reality, it was an impossible, rigged process. Whether the person floated or sank, their fate was sealed. What makes the swimming test so insidious is not just the certainty of death, but the psychological toll it took on the accused. The moment an individual was thrown into the water, they were already aware that the community had determined their guilt. The test wasn't just about the physical torture of drowning or floating. It was a public spectacle, a deeply humiliating event meant to publicly strip the accused of any dignity, turning them into mere objects for the entertainment of the spectators. The technique also showcased the complete disregard for human life that had become the hallmark of witch trials. It didn't matter whether the accused was innocent or guilty. The swimming test was a tool of terror, designed not only to punish the individual, but to instill fear in the wider community. It was meant to show everyone what would happen to anyone who defied the religious and political authorities, reinforcing the notion that challenging the system was a death sentence. Hopkins, ever the opportunist, understood that the swimming test had a psychological power far beyond the immediate victim. He used it as a spectacle to fuel public fear, knowing that the more witches he proved guilty through these tests, the more people would flock to him to ensure their own safety. The test was a visible demonstration of the power of the witch-finder general, an opportunity for the community to witness the destruction of a supposed threat, reinforcing the idea that the state had absolute control over life and death. But there was another insidious aspect to the swimming test: its profitability. Every time Hopkins conducted the test, he charged the community a fee. He profited not only from the accusation and trial, but also from the fear he generated. Each test, each accusation, each execution further fattened his wallet. The swimming test, like the rest of Hopkins' methods, was not just an act of divine judgment, but an economic transaction. He capitalized on fear, creating a cycle that perpetuated his business of witch hunting. It's difficult to overstate just how perverse the swimming test was. It was not a test at all, but a form of ritualized murder, designed not to seek truth, but to ensure the guilty verdicts that would fill Hopkins' pockets and cement his power. And yet, it was not just Hopkins who used this test. Across England and in other parts of Europe, the swimming test was conducted by other witch hunters and authorities, demonstrating how deeply entrenched the system of persecution was. Today, the swimming test stands as a chilling symbol of how superstition, fear, and greed intertwine to form a deadly, self-sustaining enterprise. It was not simply a method of determining guilt or innocence. It was a spectacle that reinforced the control of the authorities and perpetuated the economic system that fed off the destruction of lives. The swimming test, like the witch trials themselves, was a grotesque display of how power can manipulate fear and turn it into something both profitable and terrifying. On May 19, 1545, the city of Geneva became the site of one of the most chilling public executions in history, an event known as the Great Purification. Over the course of a single day, 34 people were burned alive in a spectacle designed not just to punish the accused, but to terrify an entire population into submission. This event is one of the most brutal examples of how public executions were used to maintain control over society through fear and intimidation, transforming executions into religious and political theater. What set the Great Purification apart from other mass executions was the theatricality with which it was staged. The authorities understood the psychological power of spectacle. The public execution was not just about removing those accused of witchcraft from society. It was about sending a message to the people: defy the religious and political order, and you will be publicly humiliated and tortured, with your suffering witnessed by thousands. It was a performance designed to break any remaining resistance to the theocratic authority that ruled Geneva. The method of execution itself was meticulously planned to maximize the terror it would inspire. The authorities used carefully constructed pyres, the fires designed not to burn the victims quickly, but to ensure prolonged suffering. These were not crude bonfires set to punish the guilty. They were engineered to prolong agony, turning the act of execution into a terrifying public demonstration of the power of the state and church. The flames were arranged to ensure that the victims would remain conscious for as long as possible, their screams echoing through the crowd, amplifying the terror. The execution grounds were constructed with the same care as a theater stage, with stone seating arranged so that the largest possible number of spectators could witness the suffering. Authorities knew that the psychological impact of seeing someone burned alive would be immense. The public nature of the executions ensured that everyone in Geneva, especially those who may have had doubts about the religious and political authorities, would be forced to confront the consequences of defiance. The crowds that gathered to witness these events were not just passive onlookers. They were participants in the spectacle, absorbing the terror and internalizing the message that to challenge authority was to invite unspeakable punishment. The leader of the Protestant Reformation in Geneva, John Calvin, supervised these executions, giving them religious legitimacy. The burnings were framed as divine acts of purification, cleansing society of heretics and witches. Calvin's sermons, delivered during the execution, justified the brutal methods employed, portraying the victims as enemies of God. The theological justification for such violence was grounded in the idea that the Church had the divine right to rid the world of impurity, and that suffering in this life was a necessary prelude to eternal salvation. What is particularly disturbing about the Great Purification is that it was not just about religious zealotry or a reaction to witchcraft. It was a political maneuver designed to reinforce the power of the ruling authorities. By eliminating perceived threats in such a public and brutal manner, the authorities ensured that any resistance, be it religious, political, or intellectual, would be silenced through fear. The Great Purification became a symbol of the terrifying power of religious and political authority, reminding everyone in Geneva and beyond that any deviation from the accepted norms would be met with horrific consequences. The psychological impact of the Great Purification was immense. The spectacle was designed not just to punish the guilty, but to instill fear in the wider population. Witnessing a public execution of this magnitude left a permanent scar on the collective consciousness. The trauma of seeing people burned alive in front of a cheering crowd was meant to force compliance and crush dissent. It became a tool of social control, a reminder that questioning the established order would lead to a fate worse than death. In many ways, the Great Purification was an early example of what we would later see in totalitarian regimes, where the state uses public executions, torture, and spectacle to create a climate of fear and control. The event is a chilling reminder of the lengths to which those in power will go to preserve their authority, and the terrifying consequences of unchecked religious and political power. The legacy of events like the Great Purification lives on today. The spectacle of public executions has been replaced with other forms of control and fear tactics, but the underlying principle remains the same. Fear can be used as a weapon to maintain power. The memory of the Great Purification should serve as a warning about the dangers of allowing fear, superstition, and religious authority to take control of society. It is a reminder that terror can be weaponized in the most calculated, terrifying ways to maintain the status quo and eliminate any threat to power. The witch trials were not only about terrorizing those accused of witchcraft, they were about controlling the very voice of society. One of the most disturbing and psychological forms of punishment employed during this period was the use of the scold's bridle, a device specifically designed to silence women, particularly those who were seen as outspoken, independent, or challenging the patriarchal norms of the time. Agnes Sampson, a midwife and healer from Haddington, Scotland, became one of the most infamous victims of this cruel practice. Agnes was accused of witchcraft during the North Berwick witch trials of 1590-92, largely because of her status as a healer, which threatened the male-dominated medical establishment of the time. As a woman with knowledge of herbal remedies, she represented a competing source of authority over life and death, an authority that could not be tolerated in a society where the church and male medical practitioners held absolute power. But it wasn't just her healing abilities that led to her being accused. It was her gender and her refusal to conform to the roles expected of women. The scold's bridle was a device used to publicly humiliate women by forcing them into silence. The metal mask covered the face, but the most horrifying part of the device was a spiked plate that pressed against the victim's tongue. If the woman attempted to speak or protest, the spikes would cause severe pain, often cutting into the tongue and mouth, sometimes leading to infection or even death. This device wasn't just about physical pain. It was about stripping the victim of their ability to speak, to resist, to claim any form of agency over their own fate. Agnes Sampson was forced to wear the scold's bridle as part of her punishment. She was paraded through the streets in this humiliating device, which not only silenced her, but turned her into a spectacle for public entertainment. The spectacle was designed not just to punish her, but to break the spirit of any woman who dared challenge male authority. Her public humiliation was meant to send a clear message: defy the established order, and your voice will be silenced. The use of the scold's bridle was particularly effective because it weaponized social norms. Women were not only punished for defying religious and political authorities, but also for defying the gender expectations of the time. A woman who spoke too loudly, who offered alternatives to male authority, or who defied the roles society had set for her, became an enemy of the state and the church. By silencing them physically, authorities ensured that their challenge to the status quo would never be heard again. Agnes Sampson's case is a powerful example of how the witch trials were not just about ridding society of perceived evil. They were about reinforcing the existing social order and ensuring that women, in particular, were kept in line. The scold's bridle is a stark reminder of how technology, in the form of torture devices, was used to suppress voices of dissent and to maintain a rigid, patriarchal system. What is particularly chilling about the scold's bridle is the calculated cruelty behind it. Unlike other forms of torture, which focused on physical pain alone, the scold's bridle was designed to break the human spirit. It turned the victim into an object to be paraded, gawked at, and humiliated in front of the community. It wasn't enough to simply execute women accused of witchcraft. They had to be destroyed socially, psychologically, and spiritually. They had to be made examples of for anyone who might dare to follow in their footsteps. The scold's bridle not only silenced women physically, but also symbolized the complete subjugation of their agency. It reinforced the idea that women's voices were not only unwanted but dangerous. This device turned women into objects of shame, and in doing so, it reinforced the deeply entrenched belief that women should never speak out or challenge the power of men and institutions. Agnes Sampson's punishment is an extreme example, but it was by no means rare. Many women suffered the same fate, humiliated, silenced, and broken by a system that used torture and psychological manipulation as tools of control. The scold's bridle serves as a terrifying reminder of how societies have historically treated women who step outside of prescribed roles, using both physical and social violence to ensure that they conform. This practice did not fade with the witch trials. The scold's bridle is just one example of how the authorities used torture not only to extract confessions, but to make an example of those who posed a threat to social order. Women, particularly those who were seen as powerful or subversive, became the targets of these torturous devices, meant not only to punish, but to erase their very existence from public life. The witch trials were not just about physical torment. They were an intricate psychological battle designed to break the spirit of the accused. Torture, while excruciating on a physical level, was also carefully crafted to induce a profound psychological collapse, forcing individuals into a mental state where confession became the only way to end their suffering. These techniques were not random or spontaneous. They were strategically designed to manipulate the mind, to break human will, and to convert the act of confession from a reluctant necessity to an almost logical conclusion. Victims of the witch trials were often subjected to physical pain that was calculated not only to harm, but to destabilize their sense of reality. The authorities, through their knowledge of human nature, understood that the body could endure a surprising amount of suffering, but the mind had its breaking point. The goal of torture was not merely to extract information, but to force the accused into a position where they would willingly betray their own convictions, even if it meant making false confessions. The emotional toll of these proceedings was immense, as victims found themselves trapped between the hope that confession would end their suffering and the crushing knowledge that no confession could truly save them. The psychological warfare employed by torturers was based on manipulation and deception. Victims were often told that if they confessed, their pain would cease. However, once a confession was made, the torture would continue as the authorities sought to extract further details, often leading to false confessions or accusations of others. This created a vicious cycle where victims were psychologically manipulated into a corner, believing that only through their complete submission could the suffering end. But by the time they confessed, the damage was done, not just physically, but to their very sense of self. These techniques were honed over time, developed through the insights of scholars, religious leaders, and inquisitors who studied the human mind as much as they studied the human body. Torturers were often trained in the psychological aspects of interrogation, understanding how to create an atmosphere of dread and uncertainty that made it impossible for the victim to trust their own instincts or logic. Victims were isolated, deprived of any reassurance, and subjected to intense pressure that pushed them beyond their limits. They were told that their denial of witchcraft proved they were guilty, that refusing to confess was evidence of their pact with the devil. This was the ultimate form of gaslighting, distorting reality to the point where the accused had no choice but to accept their guilt, even if they had never committed a crime. One of the most insidious aspects of the psychological pressure applied during the witch trials was the use of fear as a constant companion. Fear of the unknown, fear of the devil, and fear of the authorities combined to create an overwhelming sense of dread that kept victims on edge, unable to think clearly or make rational decisions. The psychological aspect of the trials made it far more effective than simple physical torture, as it created an environment where the victim was continuously undermined, mentally and emotionally destroyed, until they were willing to confess anything to escape the pain, even if it was a lie. Moreover, the torture techniques used in the witch trials often targeted the mind as much as the body. The extended periods of deprivation, whether through isolation, sleep deprivation, or repeated interrogations, were designed to exhaust the victim's mental defenses. The idea was to wear them down so completely that they would eventually crack under the strain. Torturers often relied on the principle that people will confess to anything when pushed hard enough, and the authorities knew that the longer the process continued, the more likely the victim was to give in. The cumulative effect of these techniques was devastating, as victims could no longer trust their own perceptions or sense of self. They became hollow shells, existing only to please their tormentors and end their suffering. The true horror of the witch trials lies not just in the physical suffering inflicted, but in the psychological torment that accompanied it. Torture was not just about breaking the body, it was about breaking the mind, pushing individuals into a state where they would be willing to betray not only their friends and families, but their own souls. The interrogators and torturers knew that fear, isolation, and psychological manipulation were just as powerful, if not more so, than physical pain, and it was through this combination of psychological and physical warfare that the authorities were able to control entire populations, ensuring that no one dared to challenge the established order for fear of what awaited them. The witch trials, then, were not simply about purging society of witches. They were about the complete submission of individuals to the authority of the state and the church. They were about breaking the will of the people, forcing them into a state of compliance where even the most horrifying acts could be justified as part of a greater moral or religious duty. It was a system designed to strip away the very humanity of the accused, reducing them to mere tools in a campaign of fear and control. One of the most notorious instruments of torture used during the witch trials was the rack, a device that epitomized the brutal efficiency with which Renaissance technology was applied to human suffering. It was a tool of exquisite, calculated cruelty, designed not only to cause immense pain, but to extract confessions through the gradual dislocation of the body. It is chilling to think that such a device was not the result of mindless violence, but of deliberate engineering, crafted with precision by those who understood human anatomy and pain tolerance. The rack was simple in appearance, yet its design was the product of careful scientific consideration. A large wooden frame with ropes or chains attached to its corners was used to stretch the victim's body. The rack's primary purpose was to dislocate the joints, pulling the arms, legs, and torso in opposite directions until the victim's body could no longer bear the strain. It was a slow, agonizing process. Each pull of the ropes was intended to increase the pressure, dislocating the joints one by one in a sequence designed to prolong the victim's suffering. The rack's precision lay in the fact that it was designed to do just enough damage to cause maximum pain without causing immediate death, ensuring that the victim could endure the torture for as long as needed to extract a confession. What made the rack so effective was not just its physical toll, but the psychological toll it took on the victim. As each joint was stretched, each ligament torn, the pain escalated, creating an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Victims were often left in this agonizing state for hours or even days, their bodies forced to endure unbearable torment while their minds slowly shattered. The rack became not just a physical torture device, but a tool of psychological warfare, designed to break the will of the accused. The authorities who used the rack were not just inflicting pain. They were manipulating the victim's mind, pushing them to the point where the only way out of the pain was to confess. And confession, as the torturers well knew, was the key. Once the accused confessed, their suffering would end, or so they were promised. But even once they confessed, the rack could still be used to extract more information, implicating others and perpetuating the cycle of fear and control. What's particularly disturbing about the use of the rack is the fact that it was operated under the guise of justice. It was not seen as an act of barbarism, but as a legitimate part of the legal process. Torture was justified as a necessary evil, a way to obtain the truth. But in reality, it was a means of terrorizing entire populations, ensuring that no one dared to defy the authorities or speak out against the witch trials. The rack served as both a physical and psychological tool for reinforcing the power structures in place, reminding the people that resistance, even in thought, would lead to unimaginable pain. The use of the rack during the witch trials also highlights the disturbing intersection of law, religion, and science. These intellectuals, these so-called experts, had the education and knowledge to understand human anatomy better than most doctors of the time. And yet, they used this knowledge not for healing, but for destruction. The rack represented the perversion of scientific advancement, a device that twisted the intellect of the Renaissance into an instrument of human agony. As the centuries passed, the rack and its derivatives would continue to influence torture methods used by authoritarian regimes. The principles of mechanical engineering, perfected on the rack, would be applied in prisons and interrogation rooms well into the 20th century. The legacy of the rack is not only in the pain it caused, but in how it set the precedent for the systematic use of torture as a tool for maintaining power. It showed that, when combined with legal frameworks, education, and religious justification, even the most refined knowledge could be used to destroy the human body and mind. The horror of the rack lies not just in the physical suffering it caused, but in how it was rationalized. It was part of a larger system of control, a mechanism designed to break the human spirit. And perhaps most chilling of all, the rack was an intellectual achievement, the product of minds that could have been used to uplift humanity, but were instead twisted to break it. Among the most terrifying forms of torture employed during the witch trials was the strappado, a method that utilized the very principles of gravity and mechanics to inflict excruciating pain. This technique was not only a physical punishment, but a calculated psychological torment, designed to dislocate joints and stretch the body in ways that were nearly impossible to endure. The irony of the strappado lies in its connection to the very science that had been revolutionizing the Renaissance, particularly the laws of motion and gravity that were being studied by the likes of Galileo. The strappado involved suspending the victim by their wrists, which were tied behind their back. The victim was then hoisted off the ground, leaving them hanging in the air, with the weight of their own body pulling down on their shoulders and arms. As the victim was lifted higher, the strain on their joints and muscles increased, eventually leading to the dislocation of the shoulders. The intense pressure on the body could cause nerve damage, and the victim could be left dangling in agony for hours or even days at a time. This form of torture was not only designed to cause pain, but to create a sense of helplessness. The victim had no control over their body or their fate, and they were fully aware that every movement, every attempt to resist, would only make their suffering worse. What made the strappado so insidious was its psychological impact. It was a form of torture that could be carried out without immediate physical harm, but one that slowly destroyed the body and the mind over time. The strappado is particularly poignant in the context of Galileo Galilei, the great scientist who had made groundbreaking contributions to the study of motion, gravity, and the cosmos. During his trial by the Roman Catholic Church in 1633, Galileo was threatened with strappado as part of his forced recantation of his heliocentric theory. Although Galileo was ultimately spared the physical torture, the psychological torment he endured was no less real. He was forced to witness the procedures of strappado and hear detailed descriptions of the suffering he would face if he refused to recant his scientific beliefs. The strappado serves as a tragic irony in Galileo's story. The very principles of motion that he had pioneered were used to design a device of torture that would have likely broken his body and spirit. To imagine Galileo, a man who had spent his life studying the mechanics of the universe, facing the threat of such a scientifically engineered method of pain, is both tragic and maddening. It demonstrates the brutal intersection of science and power, where knowledge intended to expand human understanding was instead weaponized to suppress truth and intellectual freedom. Galileo's case also highlights the ways in which the strappado was used as a tool of psychological warfare. The mere threat of strappado was often enough to force a confession, as it created an atmosphere of fear so profound that victims would willingly recant their beliefs in exchange for survival. Galileo, a brilliant mind who had challenged the very foundations of religious authority, was forced to choose between his scientific integrity and his physical survival. His recantation, driven by the fear of torture, stands as a testament to the power that fear, coupled with the promise of physical destruction, can have over even the most resolute individuals. In the broader context of the witch trials and the Inquisition, the strappado was used not just to punish, but to instill fear in entire populations. It sent a clear message: challenge the authority of the church or the state, and the consequences would be both physical and psychological. The strappado was a reminder that those who questioned the established order would not only suffer, but would be forced to confront the fragility of the human body and spirit. As brutal as the strappado was, it was also a calculated form of social control. By forcing people to witness or imagine the suffering of others, authorities ensured that fear permeated every aspect of life. The strappado became a symbol of the power of the church and the state, a tool to enforce conformity and obedience at any cost. The legacy of the strappado is not only in the torture it caused, but in the way it represented the power structures of the time. It was a reminder that intellectual and scientific progress, when manipulated by those in power, could be used to destroy rather than uplift humanity. Galileo's struggle against the strappado is a stark reminder of how fear and science can be twisted into instruments of control, and how those who sought to enlighten the world were often forced to bend to the will of those who sought to maintain their grip on power. In the annals of the witch trials, few stories are as harrowing as that of Giles Corey, the 80-year-old farmer from Salem, Massachusetts, who became the victim of one of the most psychologically twisted forms of execution ever devised: pressing. In 1692, Corey found himself accused of witchcraft during the infamous Salem witch trials, but instead of submitting to a trial, he chose to remain silent, refusing to plead either guilty or innocent. It was this refusal, an act of defiance against the system, that would lead to his slow and agonizing death by pressing. The method of pressing was deceptively simple in its design but incredibly brutal in its execution. Corey's trial began like any other, but when it came time for him to enter a plea, he refused. This choice, which seems like a mere formality, would seal his fate. Under the laws of the time, refusing to plead was considered a form of defiance against the court and the church, and so authorities decided to use this as an opportunity to extract a plea from him, or, failing that, to crush him to death. The pressing was carried out by placing a large wooden board on Corey's chest and adding stone after stone, one by one, increasing the weight gradually, ensuring that each stone would create more internal pressure without causing immediate death. The crushing of his ribs, lungs, and internal organs was slow and excruciating. Corey was given repeated opportunities to enter a plea. His defiance could be ended if he simply confessed or pleaded, but each time he resisted. His famous last words were a chilling declaration: "More weight." For 2 full days, Giles Corey endured the unrelenting pressure, his body crushed beneath the stones. His tongue eventually protruded from his mouth, and his eyes bulged as the pressure on his skull increased. But even as his physical body was slowly destroyed, his spirit remained unbroken. His silence, his refusal to give in, made him a martyr of sorts, a symbol of resistance against a system of terror that sought to break anyone who stood in its way. What is particularly haunting about Corey's story is how it reveals the depths of psychological cruelty embedded in the justice system of the time. Pressing wasn't just a physical punishment, it was a psychological trap. Corey was offered a simple choice: confess and your suffering would end. But if you refused, you would endure unimaginable pain. The beauty of this method, from the authorities' point of view, was that it didn't involve any immediate death. The victim could be kept alive for days, enduring relentless pressure while being psychologically tormented with the promise of an easier death. But this was not about bringing justice. It was about enforcing obedience through fear. The pressing of Giles Corey is a stark reminder of the ways in which the legal system, when combined with social and religious power, can be manipulated to create a self-sustaining machine of destruction. Corey's land, worth a considerable sum, was seized by the state as part of the punishment, and his execution served as a public spectacle, reinforcing the message that defiance to the law would be met with brutal retribution. The cruelty of pressing was not just in its physicality, but in its symbolism. It was a form of psychological manipulation, a slow destruction that played on the victim's ultimate fear, the fear of losing control. Corey's resistance in the face of such brutality highlights how fear can be weaponized to break even the strongest of wills. The very idea that someone could be crushed to death, bit by bit, for refusing to speak, is as much a psychological weapon as it is a physical one. It was a calculated method of breaking not just the body, but the spirit. The case of Giles Corey is also a reflection of the larger economic and political mechanisms at play in the witch trials. His land, farm, and wealth became a part of the broader system of exploitation that fueled the trials. Property seizures, economic gain, and control over the accused were central to the perpetuation of the trials themselves. Corey's death, in this sense, was not just about punishing a supposed witch. It was about stripping him of his wealth and assets, reinforcing the idea that defying the system would cost not only your life but your legacy. The legacy of Giles Corey's death by pressing continues to resonate. His story serves as a stark reminder of how systems of authority, when unchecked, can create horrors that are both deeply personal and politically motivated. His refusal to plead and his willingness to endure unimaginable suffering transforms him into a symbol of defiance against tyranny. Yet, his gruesome death also underscores the terror of living under a regime that could justify such cruelty as a legitimate form of justice. The witch trials, with their endless torment and heart-wrenching executions, left a mark on history far beyond the immediate terror they inflicted. They were not just isolated events of medieval barbarism, but part of a broader, systemic pattern of control that would shape societies for centuries to come. These trials were not mere accidents of history. They were meticulously designed campaigns of fear and suppression, driven by an intellectual elite that understood the power of terror and used it as a tool to maintain authority and control. The legacy of the witch trials is not confined to the past. The tactics used during this dark period, fear, manipulation, and cruelty, became templates for later authoritarian regimes that sought to control populations through terror. The methods of torture, the legal frameworks, and the use of fear as a tool for social control were refined during the witch hunts and later adapted by governments and regimes around the world. From the Spanish Inquisition to the brutal tactics of 20th century totalitarian states, the witch trials were the prototype for how to manipulate public perception, enforce compliance, and eliminate dissent. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the witch trials is how they revealed the capacity of human societies to rationalize cruelty. Intellectuals, scientists, and legal scholars were involved in creating and justifying the systems of persecution that led to the deaths of thousands. These were not acts of barbarism committed by ignorant peasants. They were calculated intellectual endeavors. The same intellectual rigor that produced great art, literature, and scientific breakthroughs was also used to craft devices of torture and legal structures that could justify the destruction of human beings. This paradox serves as a chilling reminder that knowledge, when perverted, can become a weapon of unimaginable destruction. The witch trials also serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority. The trials were fueled by religious and political elites who used the power of the state and church to enforce conformity and suppress those who posed a threat to their power. Whether it was women challenging patriarchal norms, intellectuals questioning religious dogma, or anyone who defied the status quo. The witch trials targeted individuals who threatened the established order. The fear of dissent and the desire to maintain control over every aspect of life led to a system where even the most minor transgressions could be punished with death, and entire communities could be terrorized into submission. One of the most lasting impacts of the witch trials is the way they shaped legal systems. The framework of the trials, with its emphasis on confessions extracted through torture and the use of guilt by accusation, laid the groundwork for future systems of judicial terror. The idea that confessions could be coerced, that suspects could be tortured into admitting guilt for crimes they never committed, would continue to haunt legal systems long after the witch trials ended. In many ways, the witch trials can be seen as a precursor to modern forms of interrogation, where fear and manipulation are used to extract confessions and maintain control. The trials also expose the way in which fear and superstition can be used to manipulate and control entire populations. By creating a climate of fear around the idea of witches and witches' power, authorities were able to control how people thought, what they feared, and how they behaved. Fear was weaponized, turning neighbor against neighbor and creating an atmosphere of paranoia where no one could feel safe. The witch trials were not just about eliminating witches. They were about creating a society where dissent, independence, and free thought were crushed by the weight of institutionalized fear. This legacy is still present today. While witch trials themselves may have ended centuries ago, the systems of control they birthed are still alive in many parts of the world. The tactics of fear, torture, and social control used during the witch hunts have been refined and applied in countless contexts since then, from colonialism to modern authoritarian regimes. The witch trials remind us that fear and terror are powerful tools for maintaining control, and that when institutions are allowed to wield these tools unchecked, entire populations can be driven to the brink of madness. As we look back on the witch trials, it's essential to remember not just the victims, the innocent women, men, and children who lost their lives, but also the lasting consequences of these campaigns of terror. The witch trials were not just about eradicating superstition or punishing crime. They were about control, about power, and about the ways in which fear can be turned into a weapon to destroy everything that stands in the way of those who seek to rule through terror. In the end, the witch trials teach us a profound lesson about the dangers of unchecked power. They remind us that when fear is weaponized, when knowledge is twisted to justify cruelty, and when authority is allowed to act with impunity, even the most civilized societies can be turned into machines of destruction. The witch trials were just one chapter in the long history of human suffering, but they continue to resonate as a warning that the power to destroy is often held by those who wield knowledge and fear, and that we must remain vigilant to ensure that history does not repeat itself.